Guesting on other people's podcasts is such a smart marketing strategy, and that's what we are talking about in today's super action-packed episode of the Agency Accelerator. And I have a fantastic guest with me who shares a ton of super valuable, insightful advice. I learned a lot on this podcast, so I know that you are going to. So we explore why this is such a good marketing strategy. We talk about how to identify the right podcasts for you to reach out to and how specifically to do that outreach. We then talk about how to measure success of the outreach programs and some do's and don'ts. So as I say, a super valuable episode, and let's get on with the show. I'm Rob DaCosta, and this is the Agency Accelerator podcast. As someone who has stood in your shoes, having started, grown and sold my own agency, I know just how it feels during the ups and the downs of agency life. So this podcast aims to ease your journey just a little by sharing mine and my guests' experiences and advice as you navigate your way to growing a profitable, sustainable and enjoyable business. So welcome everybody to today's episode of the Agency Accelerator podcast. Today we are in part 2 of a 3-part series all about podcasting. And today specifically we're talking about guesting on other people's podcasts as a core marketing strategy for your agency. And there's no one better to join me to talk about this than Alex Sanfilippo, who is at the center of the podcasting world right now. Now, Alex started his first business at the age of 10, selling used golf balls in his neighborhood. And since then, he has been the typical entrepreneur trying his hand at a number of things, including real estate, technology, aerospace, blogging, public speaking, coaching, and finally podcasting. And he is the host of the top-rated podcast, Podcasting Made Simple. He's also the founder of PodPros, a software company that focuses specifically on the podcasting industry, which includes services like Podmatch, which I use to match potential guests and hosts, as well as Podcast SOP, a project management tool that helps podcasters keep up with their episode releases. So welcome, Alex. That is a lot of different things. I'm out of breath just saying that. So how do you manage to juggle all of those priorities?
Rob, thank you so much for having me first off. And it sounds like a lot, but since we've launched PodPros as the parent organization for Podmatch and Podcast SOP, those are really the only things I do these days. And then, yes, I have the podcast as well, but that's kind of in my DNA. I feel like you have to have a podcast to be in podcasting. I like to think that at least. So I make sure that I keep up with that as well. But everything I did in my past kind of led me to where I am today. But I'm very structured, very intentional with what I do with my time. And it's just strictly the podcasting world these days for me.
Yeah, well, great place to be. I think it's such a growing area and perhaps one of the last sort of wild wests of marketing in terms of its sort of maturity. So today our focus is on being a guest on other people's podcasts as a key marketing strategy for our audience of marketing agency owners. So can I just ask you a big broad question to start with? Like, why do you think this is a good strategy?
Well, first off, you kind of just mentioned, I like that you called it the Wild West, right? It's still like the final frontier of content at this point, if you want to say that. And I think that it's a really great opportunity right now, specifically because of the amount of growth we're seeing in podcasting. Right now, there's all these big name companies. Just this morning, I heard that Twitter, someone found in their code, they are planning on adding a tab, which this is all rumored at this point, but somebody found the code for it, that they're rumored to be adding a tab for podcasting. So that's Twitter. I know that YouTube just hired a director of podcasting. Netflix hired a director of podcasting. Like all these different companies are kind of jumping on board with this. And at the end of the day, they're not interested in you and me, Rob. And I mean, the Agency Accelerator is a great show. Podcasting Made Simple is a great show, but they're after the Joe Rogans of the world, the giant celebrities. They're starting their own podcast. That's what they're after. But those tools and the listenership overflows into what we're doing as well. So right now, at an unprecedented rate, we are seeing so many people start to listen to podcasts that have never listened before. It's interesting. I just talked to somebody who is on my team. She had never listened to a podcast before, didn't even know how to. I showed her how to do it, and now she says, I can't stop listening to just tons of podcasts. And that is very common. That's not just among just a handful of people. That's on a global scale. Podcasting is really starting to take over in many ways. Because of that, I think it's a great opportunity on either side of the mic as a host or as a guest, because so many people are listening. And there was one more thing I'll mention, Rob, I'll pass it back over to you. There was a recent report done by Convince and Convert, which is a really credible source. You can look them up. They did I don't know how many people were in this poll, but I know it was thousands. They were asking podcast listeners why they listen to podcasts. And over 50% said they listen with the intent of learning something new. They want to increase their knowledge. They want a better understanding of the world around them. And I found that to be a really interesting thing. So if anyone's in the space of educating somebody, whether it's about their company, whether it's about, I don't know, schooling, education, right? Those things specifically, there's a lot of benefit right now to be in this space.
Yeah, and I think podcasting is such an easy, digestible medium to learn from. It's certainly, you can do it on the move, you can do it at the gym, which is when I listen to podcasts, or when you're driving or sitting on the train, and it's certainly easier to digest than it would be reading the equivalent text on a blog, or even watching a YouTube video. So I feel like that for me is one of the reasons why I wanted to get into it. So let's talk about some of the mechanics. So if I sort of think, right, okay, so me being a guest on other people's podcasts is a really good strategy, because I can get in front of their audience and I can teach them something and demonstrate that I know what I'm talking about, and hopefully they'll link back to me. How do I go about doing that? How do I even find those podcasts? And, what some of the ideas that they should think about when they're doing this?
Yeah, I think the first thing, it's a really insightful question, Rob. I'm glad you asked that. The first thing that always comes to mind is, for me, if I'm going to jump on people's podcast, I need to know why I'm doing that and have that really specifically clear. Because one thing that people realize, if they're new to podcast guesting land, like you're gonna step into this world, there's a lot of shows that would love to have you. But and here's why I say that: I have comedy shows all the time wanting me to be on their show. Rob, between you and me and everyone listening, I'm not really that funny, so I know I'm not going to do well there. I enjoy playing soccer, so sometimes soccer podcasts want me to come on and talk, and I'm not like a professional or anything like that. But here's the thing: if I just start going on all these podcasts, I'm going to use all of my time doing this with little to no benefit at all. Now, if it's a hobby and people just want to do it for fun, that's great. Then by all means do that. That's a great thing. It's fun. Maybe it adds value to somebody. But I think what the most important thing that we each need to do is it needs to start with us, and us determining really why we want to do this. And as soon as you determine why, then you start identifying the shows that you say are ideal. Even if you start from like the really big shows, I mean, I do not recommend going after like the million plus shows and trying to be on those. You'll hit your head against a wall for years before you have any lead on that. But you can look at them and say, you know what, this show is a great mold of what I'm looking for. Can I find smaller, more boutique shows that fit this same mold, that are like this model, because it really aligns with my why? When you can identify these things, that's kind of my opening to it. I think that's where you begin, is by starting to find these things. And you can do this a lot of ways, like actually getting into the practical side of like, where do you find them? Podmatch, I'm not going to plug that too much, but our service is specifically designed to do that. So that's a really helpful tool for a lot of people there. And Rob, you can do whatever you want with that. But another way is you can just jump on social media, start asking your connections. Has anyone heard a show that talks about this? People love podcasting in the world today. Wherever you post on social media, someone is going to tag a host that fits what you're looking for, as long as you get really good at explaining it, even just in some of your content. You might be able to get directly connected with them right there through LinkedIn, through Facebook, through Instagram, wherever you choose your poison, social media these days. But you might be able to find those people really easily doing that. And then you just start a conversation from there.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, for sure, we'll put a link to Podmatch in the notes, because that is a great source. I think once you've figured out the kind of podcast you want to be on and the kind of topics you can talk about, then going to a source like Podmatch is great. But you need to get that first bit right, first of all. And of course, the other thing you can do is go and ask, like you say, ask your audience. If you've got a customer base, go ask them, what podcast do they listen to? Because at the end of the day, you want to, if I'm a marketing agency owner, I want to find more people like my customer. So if I find the podcast that they listen to, then I'm going to by default, by definition, reach more of those ideal target customers.
I think that's brilliant, by the way. Ask your customers that you currently have what they listen to. That's a really good lead right there. Very smart. I like that.
Yeah. So, okay. So let's imagine now I've got my short list, my dream 50 podcasts that I want to be on. Can you talk us through perhaps some do's and don'ts of how to outreach to them, and what are some of the ways I can do it?
Yeah, this is important, because this makes or breaks a deal. I had somebody email me just yesterday, Rob, and they told me that they need to find more podcasts because they only get on 3% of the podcasts that they're pitching to be on. And my response to them, I tried to be as respectful as I could, but I'm like, if you're only getting on 3 out of 100, then the problem is what you're saying to them, not the podcast itself, right? That's just, something isn't right. So I think it's really important that you get this right. And pitch is, I believe, kind of like a terrible word, but that is technically, I guess, the industry standard of what you're doing. You are pitching, saying, I want to be on your show. Here's why. And so I find a few really key things that I'll just quickly run through, Rob. Number one is to lead with value. That is absolutely the first thing. I think you can only lead with value if you listen, if you dive in a little bit. A perfect example of this is Rob, when you and I started talking about having me on the show, the first thing I did is started listening. And I gave you a complimentary for this. As a matter of fact, anyone who's listening to this, who's just now starting to join the show, go back to February 3rd, 2022, and listen to Rob's solo episode about how and why he started a 4-day work week. Super insightful. It's something that I aspire to be like. I think it's an incredible episode. Everyone should go listen to it. But right there, what I just did is I led with value. Like that is the value. I'm saying, hey, I like your show. There's something about it that's really good. So you want to make sure that you're starting that way, not saying, I want to be on your show because I have someone I want to talk to. I want to grow my business. I this, I that. You don't want to do that. You want to start with like that leading with value. And from there, you make a meaningful request. Something else I find is a lot of people, even if they get that part right, they never actually specifically make an ask. So if Rob, you're receiving an email from me and it's like, well, what does this guy actually want? That shouldn't be the case. You need to know what the person wants. So for me, a meaningful request means I want to be on the show, but I also know what I want to add to the show. So when Rob was starting this series that we're in right now, I saw that he started the series and I said, oh, my meaningful request is I'd love to be on the show because I can add value in this podcasting space. It was really a natural fit. Now, whether he said yes or no, that's up to him. But I wasn't saying I want to talk about skateboarding, golf, the sun, right? Like I'm not talking about that. I'm saying, hey, I see you're in this series. I think I can add some value in that space.
Sorry to interrupt you, Alex, or even worse, because I think this happens all the time. I'm not telling you how I can flog my product to you, your audience. So that it's not even about talking about a different topic. It's sometimes people just don't understand that they've got to lead with value, that they think, actually, if I'm coming on your podcast, it's giving me a 30-minute free advertisement to sell my business, to sell my product. And of course, that doesn't work. You're never going to get past the first hurdle, are you? You're going to end up with that 3% if that's what you do.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. That's so important. And for me, I don't know if you've had this happen. Have you ever had anybody who kind of broke through and you just couldn't use the episode on your show?
Yes, I won't name it, but I was a bit mortified because this was someone that had done a really good, or their PR people had done a really good pitch. And I don't know whether I just caught this person on a bad day, but they were really dull. They didn't add any value, and they just kept trying to sell their business. And I got off that call and I thought, I can't use this because I'm going to be doing a poor service to my audience if I do.
Yeah. Hopefully we circle back around to that because I think that's an important part of the topic here. You've got to have value in the episode too. If it turns into a sales pitch, Rob and I, we're gatekeepers as podcast hosts. We cannot give you access to our audience if it's not helping them. Like they trust us, so we have to be able to do that. But anyway, I digress. Moving right along here, I'll jump back into this real quick. After you make that, so it's lead with value, make that meaningful request, and then offer credibility. So if you know somebody that person knows, or in some circle you're connected, just mention that credibility, because then you don't have to go into your whole bio. Just link out to something about you. If people want to learn more, if the host, you can say, here's my website. You can learn a little bit more about me on the about page. But say, hey, we know this mutual connection. I did some work with them previously. In many cases, when that happens to me, I'm like, oh, well, I don't even need to look at you anymore. I can already trust you. I know you because you know this person. That's a big win if you can just keep that really brief, really short. And the next thing that I find that really helps podcast hosts is just mention that you're going to share the episode. If you really are, don't lie, have some integrity. But if you're willing to share it, mention that, because there's such a few amount of guests that are willing to actually share an episode that they're on, that knowing that up front is really helpful for a podcast host, because we want help growing our audience. We only have our network. We're trying to expand it. And with the help of a guest, we can do that pretty easily. And the very last thing I'll mention is make it easy to say no. Sales people don't really agree with this, but I would rather hear back than not hear back. So I always end with something like, hey, no pressure at all. If it isn't a good fit, just let me know. But either way, I'd love to hear from you. I just keep it really, really simple. I want people to be able to say easily, no, it's just not the right fit, other than keeping me in limbo forever, because that's kind of an annoying thing where you're like, I wonder if I'll ever get on that show. I'd rather just know now. So those are kind of the 5 things, Rob, that I do every time I'm trying to set up some sort of pitch to talk to a podcast host.
Such good advice. And I think this will be good advice for people that have never done this before, but also for people that have done it but are perhaps not getting the success in terms of the guest slots. And therefore, you just need to listen to what Alex said, because it's interesting that just like you, Alex, I sit on both sides of this fence. I've been a guest on podcasts and I run my own podcast, and I have truly seen the good, the bad, and the ugly of this. Like, often what I get is I get an unsolicited email from someone saying, I think I'd make a great guest on your podcast. Here's my bio. And then I will always reply by saying, perhaps a bit facetiously, but saying, which episodes did you enjoy listening to? Because I know they haven't listened to any of the episodes.
Right.
And why do you think you can add value to my audience? And again, if they have listened to even one episode, they know who the audience is and they can answer that question. But a lot of the time when I go back and ask that question, and I've got like a pre-written email template because I get, 2 or 3 of these every single day. And half the time I never hear from them again because they are just taking this approach of throwing it out there and hoping some of it sticks. And I think that's a really bad strategy. So
it's a terrible strategy. And one funny story with that, I had one person reach out. I said, "What episode did you like?" And they responded and they said, "Oh, I really liked your episode with Fred Durst." And they went on to explain about how it was like a childhood hero of theirs. The funny thing is I never had Fred Durst on my podcast. I had Fred Dust on my podcast, which was about a guy who talks about like making great conversations. So not only did they not listen, they lied about listening and got the name wrong. I didn't. That's the only time I've just never responded. I'm like, I don't have anything nice to say, and I've always been taught if you have nothing nice to say, don't say anything at all. So I just was like, just going to let that one slide. But yeah, you're right. There has to be some integrity in it, and you can tell when somebody listens based off what they say. It's not broad. Oh, I like your voice, and I like how long. There's got to be something specific that they say. I really like this. Like when I complimented on the fact that you figured out the 4-day work week. Like I'm after that. I've listened to that. I know that content. Doing that is such an important thing.
And it doesn't take a lot of effort, does it, to spend 10 or 15 minutes listening to a podcast and saying, I really enjoyed this episode. However, there's another angle to it that I think I could bring to your audience. That's a smart strategy, a smart approach. And I don't think it takes too much effort. And I just wanted to pick up on one other thing that you said, Alex, which is that when you are guesting on someone else's podcast, it has to be a symbiotic win-win for both sides. And the win for the podcast host is that they're getting some great value and some great insights that they wouldn't otherwise have. But it's also the fact that they can potentially reach a larger audience because, as you said, the guests should share it. So you just need to be mindful that it is a win-win for both sides.
Yeah, it really it's a huge win-win. And it's weird with podcasting, Robin, you know this. A lot of listeners, podcast listeners are very savvy. And because it's audio only, the rest of your mind starts traveling. You almost don't even need to say your name when you go on a podcast because people are going to find a way to look you up because out of just curiosity. After hearing something, you want to see it somehow. And whether that's pictures of somebody or a business, if I never mentioned what I did, I don't think it would change the amount of people who go find me still because that's just what podcast listeners do. And there's data to show that podcast listeners are savvy. They search. They're pretty smart. And a lot of people, they jump on, like you said, to try to sell. But in reality, I find if you just do the opposite and seek to be a person of value instead of a person of profit, it takes care of itself in many ways.
Yeah, I mean, there's a really nice expression that I use quite a lot, which is serve, not sell. I mean, then that's true in everything. That's true in all of your marketing. It's true in being a guest on a podcast. It's true in delivering a presentation or whatever it is. We just need to make sure that we are adding value to our audience. And in doing that, we demonstrate our credibility and our ability to help them beyond the podcast or beyond whatever it is that we are doing. I want to ask you one thing, because one thing that annoys me quite a lot, this is me getting on my kind of soapbox now, is that when I get, and you didn't do this, which I think is really good, when I get a pitch for directly from someone or from an agency that's representing them, often the bios are talking to me about how they've started multi-trillion-dollar businesses and they're this amazing person. And that often really puts me off because I think you won't be able to relate to my audience, which might be that struggling agency owner or that agency owner with 10 staff. And so that sometimes puts me off. What's your view on that?
Man, this is such a good point because yes, you're right. That's a big no-no across the board. And I've done my best to shorten my bio to make it better. I'm always working on it, but I don't need to put the fact that I've made all this money, I've done this. Like that doesn't need to come up because that doesn't really add value to anybody. I get the perspective is that it adds credibility, but here's the thing: for the listenership at that point, they already trust you. They already have that. You already have that credibility with them because. Example, Rob, you put me on the podcast. Your listeners automatically are already subject to trust me because you trust me. I don't need to sell the fact that, oh, I've done all these great things. I've achieved so much. Like, I don't need to do that anymore. That's already done. It's like when someone gets on a stage, you don't need to go into any bio at all when you're speaking physically on a stage because someone has already done that for you. You've been pre-vetted. Everyone there trusts the fact that you deserve to be there. And
Yeah.
I think that, yeah, we need to bring it back down to a human level because sure, if I made $1 billion company, it'd be hard not to mention it, but that doesn't help anybody because not there's so few people that have done that, right? So you don't need to jump into that. What I could say is I've been in business for 15 years. I have been like on the grind for 15 years because people can relate to that. Oh, 15 years in business. I know what that's like. I don't need to mention all the accolades that come with that. And I'm in agreement. It needs to be human. It needs to connect with the audience. If you make yourself seem like some supernatural person, you're already creating a disconnect between the people that are listening to the show.
Yeah, no, I think the human aspect of it is probably the bit that bothers me because they're putting themselves up here so far out of the reach of the average listener. Let me just move the conversation on a bit and ask you a little bit about how do you measure the success of doing this? So if I decided that guesting on a podcast was a major marketing strategy for me to build my business, obviously one of the obvious ways of measuring it is, am I getting on enough podcasts? But how else would I measure the success?
Yeah, there's a lot of options here, and it depends on how analytics driven somebody is. You can add something like a UTM to something to see our listeners to this podcast episode coming to my website or landing page, or wherever it is you want them to go. That's one way to do it. And I started off doing a little bit of that, but I completely stopped doing that because at the end of the day, I just want an arsenal of podcast episodes that I can forward to people without me having to recreate the content. That's a win for me. If I have all the educational material available for somebody, that's great. So example, if somebody that owns a company, they've got their, you're the agency accelerator. Like that's what you do, Rob. Like that's your background and that's your podcast. If somebody comes to me like, hey, I've got a small to mid-sized business. I'm thinking about podcast guesting. What do you think? I'm literally going to send them this podcast episode. I don't even need to like have a long conversation with them. I can just be like, here it is. Obviously, I'm human. I'm going to have a conversation, but having this is super helpful. So for me, it's the available education for people is how I measure it. And I basically measure it by, do I actually have the answers to the questions people are asking me through podcast interviews that I've been on? If I don't have the answers, then I feel like maybe I'm not actually succeeding as a podcast guest. That's the way I measure it. But again, people can measure it so many ways. You can say, here's a landing page, here's a free tool, here's a book, and just see if things are going that direction. Additionally, are the assets that come with it are a big win. If I were to buy what you'll probably do for me after this episode, I would spend hundreds of dollars on things that I can share on social media, little clips, having the audio, having the video, right? All those things would cost me a lot as a person to do. But thankfully, Rob, like you're a great host, those kind of come for free. They're a bonus. And it's like a win-win when they're shared. To me, those are kind of the ways that I track it. The main reason, once again, being the educational material that I have access to of me speaking now.
Yeah, and listen, that's such a good kind of thought, the way of thinking of this, because I hadn't really thought of that before. But that is so true that you can share. That's it's interesting, isn't it? Podcasting is about creating legacy rather than about instantaneous wins. It's not like I'm going to run a big Google ads or Facebook campaign and get a load of leads from it instantly. It's more about building this legacy. And I guess you are doing exactly that when you are a guest on other people's podcasts, and you get to share those podcasts with the relevant audience members.
Yeah, I'm going to give you credit for that quote, but podcasting is about creating legacy. That's a great quote right there. I'm going to post that on social media. Don't worry, I'll tag your name in it. But I love that. And it develops this know, like, and trust with people, right? At the end of the day, you can become an expert or seem to be the expert. You're the authority. You have credibility that's growing just from doing this. A great example of this, and I'll share the story that's really brief here. Recently, I was looking for SMS marketing tools. Like I wanted to get into text message marketing, and I found 3 companies through Google search. And the next thing I did is I went to podcast. I went to see if I could find any podcast about how to succeed with this. One of those 3 companies had one of their C-suite people talking on podcast. I consumed all of that content, learned it really well, bought that product because I felt like I could trust them. They gave me a lot of free education. I went back just out of curiosity. They were the most expensive of the 3 options, but they're the ones that were devoted the most to my success through the medium that I love, which is podcasting. That to me, once again, that's that legacy that's getting created. In the moment, here's the thing, they'll never know that I bought their product because of that. There's no way they could ever track that. But that's actually what happened. That's building a true legacy, I believe.
Yeah, that's so true. And one of the things I like about the medium of podcasting is that you can start to build relationships with people more rapidly because it's sort of 2-dimensional as opposed to like an email or a blog. where you don't hear someone's voice, you don't hear their personality. And so it's much more one dimensional. And I'm not saying you shouldn't do those things. I'm a massive believer in email marketing, but in terms of building relationships more rapidly and building that know, like, and trust, podcasting, YouTube, and all that stuff is such a great way of doing it, isn't it?
It really is. I couldn't agree more with that.
So before we sort of wrap this up, are there any other nuggets of advice that we haven't touched upon that you would say to people, like if they're thinking about building a podcasting guesting strategy? Any other pieces of advice that you haven't shared?
Yeah. So going back to having that why is just so important. Make sure that you really know the direction you want to go in. Additionally, make sure that you figure out the stories that you're going to share. You don't want to share the same thing on every podcast, but you want to have the direction figured out. Really building up this plan intentionally is going to be what really serves you. At the end of the day, I had no objective going, like, or no, nothing going into this that Rob would like ask me a question. I tried to divert it somewhere else. I answered his questions exactly how I heard them, but I make sure I know this stuff. I make sure that I have the direction planned of where this can be helpful for people. And like we were saying early on, you got to lead with value. Let the profit follow, but you've got to lead with value. So I think that those are just really some really key things if you want to succeed in podcasting.
Yeah, and I've got to say that that's the difference between a good guest and a bad guest. A good guest listens to the questions, answers the questions, is honest, bears in mind who the audience is. A bad guest has got their agenda. A bad guest is like a politician. They've got their agenda that they want to follow, regardless of what the question is or who the audience is. So just one other really quick question, sort of a mechanics question really, is that there are, just to touch upon this, there are a number of ways that you can have an outreach campaign to get on other people's podcasts. So do you just want to talk a bit about them, like doing it yourself, hiring an agency, using places like Podmatch and so on?
Yeah, it's a good point. So yeah, Podmatch is a service that you can use that will do it. There's also people that will do it for you. You'll pay a little bit to do that. It has a premium cost. But if you're saying my time is better spent working on my agency, then do that by all means. And there are some great podcast booking services out there that will get you on the ideal shows. They'll even help you with that. So if you feel you need extra help, that's a really good thing. And then lastly, there's the cold outreach through social media. It's the toughest. It's definitely the guerrilla version of it, but it works. If you can get really good at it, you can do it well. The one thing that you're going to want to make sure you create, Podmatch helps you with this, a booking agency will, but if you're doing it on your own social media, it won't. Have some sort of media one sheet. That means have your pictures all ready to go, have your bio set up, have questions you're ready to be asked, give people some ideas for topics that you can cover, anything that they would want. The idea is to have it all right there, because if you don't, you are going to play this back and forth game with podcast host. It'll be weeks of, hey, I need this, hey, I need that, hey, I need this. Have it all in one place ready to go for them so they can make a really clear decision if they want you or not. And also they don't have to bother you too much afterwards. You'll have it all in one place. But those are kind of the three big options. And that media one sheet is so important to have.
Yeah, great advice. And you know, everyone should go check out Podmatch, because it actually enables you to put everything you've just explained in one place, and it also enables you to search for potential podcasts, to be found by potential podcast hosts. So it's a good platform. So I'll do your cheerleading for that. Even
thank you.
Just let me ask you my final question that I ask all my guests, which is, now you're not that old, so it can't be that far back for you. But if you could go back in time and give your younger self, just starting out in business, maybe not the 10-year-old golf ball collector, but someone a bit older, what would be the one piece of advice you would give yourself?
Yeah, you know, I knew this question was coming, but I try not to think about it too much up front because I want it to be authentic. And I do ask myself this question on a regular basis. I would tell myself to stop overcomplicating things. Stop overcomplicating things. I find that I do that a little bit. And I always hold on to this quote by Leonardo da Vinci. And he just said that simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. If I can learn to keep things more simple and just keep the main thing, I could drive forward a lot faster as someone who naturally overcomplicates things a little bit. That's the advice I give my younger self, because I think I did myself a huge disservice, especially in my late teens, early 20s, by just being in this gridlock of constant like perfection chasing and things like that. So yeah, keep the main thing, and remember that keeping things simple is the right direction to go.
Yeah, good bit of advice. And I've got to say, tying it back to my 4-day working week, if I didn't apply that, I wouldn't be able to do it. And so one of the things I had to do, I'm not going to go off tangent on here, but one of the things I had to do when I decided to work a 4-day week is get rid of a lot of stuff that wasn't actually, you know, giving me any value, but I was just comfortable doing it. And so, yes, simplicity. It's really interesting. And I say this so often, but I've asked this question 50 or 60 times now, and I've almost never had the same answer twice, which is amazing, isn't it? And for our 100th episode, people can go back and listen to that. I actually collated 40 guests feedback into that 100th episode, and we put together a kind of freebie download of sort of inspirational things that people have said. So Alex, you'll be glad to know that no one has actually said that before, which is great. So if people wanted to find out more about Alex and more about, your products and your business, where would they go?
So everything I do is at podpros.com. Podpros.com has everything I'm involved in, the podcast, the softwares. It's all focused on education, helping people in the podcasting space. But podpros.com is everything I do. But honestly, what you're doing here with the Agency Accelerator, Rob, this is incredible. I love this. I recommend listeners to hang with you because you're really taking them places. And I'm going to go back and listen to that 100th episode myself. I'm really excited to hear that today.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Well, we will put links to that into the show notes. And I just want to say a huge thank you for sharing, your value and your knowledge today. It's sort of given me some food for thought, and I know it will definitely give our listeners some. So thanks for joining me today.
So glad to hear that, Rob. Thank you again for having me. It was truly an honor.